Just days after President Donald Trump announced that he'd be bringing American troops currently in Syria home, another gas attack has been reported in Syria, with fingers pointing mostly towards Assad and even Putin as potential culprits. So I guess we're not going anywhere. Now, of course, this prompted Donald Trump to respond via Twitter, where he said many dead, including women and children, in mindless chemical attack in Syria. Area of atrocity is in lockdown and encircled by Syrian army, making it completely inaccessible to outside world. President Putin, Russia, and Iran are responsible for backing animal Assad. Big price to pay. Open area immediately for medical help and verification. Another humanitarian disaster for no reason whatsoever. Sick. Now, embedded in that tweet is the assumption that Donald Trump wants to open the area that's currently in lockdown so there can be a proper investigation conducted before he makes any rash military decisions. However, it didn't take long for him to change his mind, because when he spoke about this, he seemed to be a lot more militaristic in what he was saying.
I'd like to begin by condemning the heinous attack on innocent Syrians with banned chemical weapons. It was an atrocious attack. It was horrible. You don't see things like that, as bad as the news is around the world. You just don't see those images. We are studying that situation extremely closely. We are meeting with our military and everybody else, and we'll be making some major decisions over the next 24 to 48 hours. We are very concerned when a thing like that can happen. This is about humanity. We're talking about humanity, and it can't be allowed to happen. So we'll be looking at that barbaric act and studying what's going on. We're trying to get people in there. As you know, it's been surrounded, so it's very hard to get people in, because not only has it been hit, it's been surrounded. And if they're innocent, why aren't they allowing people to go in and prove? Because, as you know, they're claiming they didn't make the attack. So if it's Russia, if it's Syria, if it's Iran, if it's all of them together, we'll figure it out, and we'll know the answers quite soon. So we're looking at that very, very strongly and very seriously.
So things are moving pretty fast, and by the time you see this video, it may be the case that we already know what Donald Trump is wanting to do. Now, before I dive any deeper into this discussion, I can't not point out the hypocrisy in what Donald Trump is saying here, because as someone who supposedly cares a lot about humanity, his illegal drone war killed an estimated 4,500 civilians abroad just last year. However, he wants us to believe that all of a sudden he has this newfangled appreciation for life, when we all know that that's not the case. Now, of course, I think that the reason why he's sounding a lot more hawkish is because it's now officially the case that John Bolton is his national security advisor, and almost immediately when he stated his intent to withdraw troops from Syria, what happened? His advisors, mainstream media pundits, all beat him over the head and basically said this is a horrible idea, you're going to empower ISIS, and now this is kind of being framed as well, since Donald Trump announced that he wants to bring the troops home from Syria and kind of lay off of Syria. Now Assad felt empowered and decided to gas his own people. So the question is, what's going to happen? Will Donald Trump act? Will he decide to escalate it even further and bomb Syria again? Well, before we talk about that, first and foremost, taking military action, generally speaking, it's not up to Donald Trump, because as Representative Barbara Lee points out, correctly so, this is not President Trump's decision to make. Congress, not the president, gets to decide when to go to war. And this is a really important point, because this shouldn't be about what Donald Trump wants, because if Congress does not authorize this war in Syria, then nothing should be done. And the reason why this was a really important part of the U.S. Constitution is because if we get a maniac like Donald Trump or George W. Bush, then they can't unilaterally wage war. They have to go through Congress. But now we've just abandoned that philosophy, and in the mainstream media, we don't even discuss this. We don't even discuss whether or not Donald Trump should ask for Congress's approval to wage war in Syria. Why not? The Constitution certainly wasn't amended. I don't remember it being amended, do you? So why aren't we making him go through Congress? Why isn't the media pointing this out more so? And additionally, we have to ask ourselves this: why on earth would Assad carry out a chemical attack on his own people just days after President Donald Trump announced that he would be bringing American troops home? That flies in the face of reason. Why would you basically provoke the United States to attack you and stay there when they just announced that they would be leaving your country? Makes no sense whatsoever, right? I mean, when Assad finally, seemingly at least, gets Donald Trump off of his back, he does something he knows will definitely provoke Donald Trump to take military action against him specifically. I mean, why would he do that? It's not adding up, and these were the same types of questions we were asking the last time when it was reported that Assad used chemical weapons against his own people, which ultimately persuaded Donald Trump to attack a Syrian airfield. And, as it turns out, Secretary of Defense James Mattis recently admitted that there was no evidence that Assad used poison gas on his people. So Donald Trump bombed Syria when they did not have sufficient evidence to implicate Assad. And now we're doing it again. So, getting to that article, Newsweek's Ian Wilkie states, lost in the hyper-politicized hullabaloo surrounding the Nunes Memorandum and the Steele dossier was the striking statement by Secretary of Defense James Mattis that the U.S. has no evidence that the Syrian government used the banned nerve agent sarin against its own people. This assertion flies in the face of the White House memorandum, which was rapidly produced and declassified to justify an American Tomahawk missile strike against the Shayrat base in Syria. Mattis offered no temporal qualifications, which means that both the 2017 event in Khan Sheikhoun and the 2013 tragedy in Ghouta are unsolved cases in the eyes of the Defense Department and Defense Intelligence Agency. Mattis went on to acknowledge that aid groups and others had provided evidence and reports but stopped short of naming President Assad as the culprit. There were casualties from organophosphate poisoning in both cases, that much is certain, but America has accused Assad of direct responsibility for sarin attacks and even blamed Russia for culpability in the Khan Sheikhoun tragedy. Now its own military boss has said on the record that we have no evidence to support this conclusion. In so doing, Mattis tacitly impugned the interventionists who were responsible for pushing the Assad is guilty narrative twice without sufficient supporting evidence, at least in the eyes of the Pentagon. And now we're being asked to buy into this same narrative again without evidence. We need details. An investigation needs to be conducted. We can't just act hastily. This is the military. Russia is there. We can escalate. But the mainstream media, politicians are telling us we have to act quickly. We can't even think about it. Now, I'm not suggesting that Assad is a nice guy. In fact, I think he's an objectionable human being. But the question isn't whether or not he's a good person. It's whether or not he's guilty here, and we currently don't have enough evidence to pin blame on him. But for some reason, the narrative is that we have to take action quickly. Donald Trump has to retaliate immediately. Hence why he said he wants to make a decision within 24 to 48 hours. It's because people in his ear, neoconservative warmongers, are pushing him to do that. The mainstream media, who has advertisers in the military-industrial complex, defense contractors, is pushing for this. So Donald Trump is influenced with all of this chatter in his ear to do something incredibly irresponsible and hasty that would be horribly problematic. In fact, so problematic that Russian diplomats are saying that the situation could potentially spiral out of control if Donald Trump does, in fact, attack Syria. I mean, he's literally now flirting with World War III, and that's not hyperbolic to say. And as John Keeley of Common Dreams reports, with war fanatic John Bolton in the White House for the first time as his new national security advisor on Monday night, President Donald Trump gathered his military advisors together as lawmakers and anti-war policy experts raised warnings that any move by the president to attack Syria in the wake of a suspected chemical attack over the weekend would not only be extremely dangerous, but also illegal. So here we are again for probably the 10th time since Donald Trump became president, worrying about the prospect of us escalating and getting even closer to World War III. It's already bad enough that we are now officially living through another Cold War. But they're influencing Donald Trump, people in the media, politicians, to take quick action here, to retaliate before we have evidence that Assad is in fact guilty. Now, people are trying to frame this as the compassionate thing to do, to retaliate against Assad for him using chemical weapons on his own people. That's the humanitarian thing to do. But let me remind you again that there's no such thing as a humanitarian war. And people who are framing this as a compassionate thing to do, to attack Syria and beating the war drums, are lying to you. The amount of destruction and devastation that could ensue if Trump's actions here escalated into a hot war between the US and Russia would be incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands could potentially die in that type of scenario. So by pulling on the heartstrings of Americans, by trying to frame this as the compassionate thing to do, it's not the first time they've done this, they're lying to you. This is propaganda. CNN, I believe it was the network that actually had on a little girl from Syria who basically said, you have to help us. You have to take out Assad. Save us. That's the type of saber rattling and propaganda that we see in mainstream news. But when you actually talk to people like Tulsi Gabbard, Rania Khalek, a journalist who went to Syria and who's had conversations with the Syrian people, I mean, it's lose-lose for them. They don't necessarily like Assad, but taking him out would be probably the worst-case scenario for them, because then you allow terrorist organizations like ISIS to take control of the country. So what we're seeing is a lot of war propaganda. Neoconservative warmongers want us to think that we're immoral if we don't support Donald Trump taking hasty military action to attack Assad before we even know that he's guilty yet. And again, even if we can confirm, if we had the evidence to confirm that he's guilty, does that mean that we should attack Assad, knowing what's at stake, knowing that Russia would be against it, and they might want to escalate further with us, and that Iran might want to escalate with us? I mean, this is a really, really terrifying scenario. And a lot of people accuse me and other progressives of being hyperbolic in talking about the potential for World War III. But with so much on the line, with so many lives that would be lost, I think we're right to sound the alarms. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that we invaded Iraq under false pretenses. We were told that they had weapons of mass destruction, and now we're being told that Assad is using chemical weapons against his own people, and the Secretary of Defense is saying, actually, when we bombed them because Assad allegedly used chemical weapons against his own people, well, we actually don't have evidence that he's the culprit. First and foremost, it should not be up to the president to unilaterally wage war. That's up to Congress. Second of all, even if Donald Trump is empowered to act, if Congress gives him the authority to act, to take action against Syria, that doesn't mean that we should. So this is incredibly troubling. There's really nobody countering this narrative in the mainstream media at all. So I think the aggregate public, American citizens, are going to go along with it.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.